Voltaire lives through the 18th century under the kings of France. So Louis the 14th, 15th, and 16th. Those three men begin the middle and the end, and Louis the 16th is overthrown by the French Revolution. So this is the world that Voltaire knows. These are the kings of France. In the beginning, when he's born, when he's a young man, Louis the 14th is the most powerful French king ever in history, and the most powerful king in Europe at that time. He's succeeded by a great-grandson who rules a very, very long time and basically just sits on top of the structure of the monarchy, living at Versailles. And then his grandson takes over, Louis the 16th, with his wife Marie Antoinette, and they experience the French Revolution. They're overthrown and both executed. So I've put in this marker so you can kind of remember where we are in the history of France. 1715, death of Louis. As you know, Louis has been king for like 70 years, so the longest reign ever in history. And of course, the government and the overall management of the French state and economy is a disaster. Louis, as you'll remember from our evening on Louis, invaded practically everybody and wasted a lot of French money on troops and a war, one of the biggest wars of all, the War of the Spanish Succession. It was a massive amount of money just wasted, burned up. And so he leaves France devastated. The finances are a mess. When he dies, his great-grandson is only 5 years old, so his little great-grandson has to have a regent, so they're going to have a period of the regency when an uncle is going to run France. Naturally, they don't want to upset any cart, so there's not going to be any reform. And so we enter into the 1700s with France not reforming anything, certainly not calling a parliament, which if they had done it in 1715, they might have escaped the revolution in 1789. But they certainly are not going to do that. They do not do it. And so what we get then, if you think about it, 1715 to 1789, so that's 74 years in which France coasts. France coasts sort of on autopilot with all the problems that are there going unsolved. Various people come along and try to solve them. Various finance ministers come along and try to come up with better tax situation. All didn't make any difference. In general, the country is just floating along, heading towards it's the Titanic. It's heading to the iceberg, and it isn't going to do any good to tell them to change direction because it's too late. And so you really have almost here from here on almost a century to the revolution, in which people like Voltaire are going to write again and again and again and again, we have to reform, we have to reform, we have to reform, and it didn't do any good. He publishes various things in his early career when he comes home from the Amsterdam, so in the teens, right away after the death of Louis XIV, and immediately he's arrested, and he will be arrested again and again and again. So he will be exiled from his country, he'll be arrested, he'll come back, he'll publish again, he'll be arrested again, he'll leave. And that's really the way he lives out his life right to the end, with the last part of it with the solution of buying property on the line between Switzerland and France. So the great chateau I'm going to show you here, Ferney, F-E-R-N-E-Y, which you can visit, is located right on the border. And so it meant that if the French came to arrest him, he could run into Switzerland. If the Swiss came to arrest him, he could run into France. So it was chosen for that, and it worked. It worked. To send an order from Paris to arrest him meant the order would get to him faster than they could get their horses and their soldiers there. And so he could always run if he had to. But he's going to spend time in the Bastille right away, and he became famous for writing this little witty, sort of poetic political commentary. I have seen the Bastille and 1,000 other prisons filled with brave citizens, faithful subjects. I have seen the people wretched under a rigorous servitude. I have seen the soldiery perishing of hunger, thirst, and rage. I have seen a devil in the guise of a woman ruling the kingdom. Now that was the roughest of all the things he said, because it implied that the regent was being governed by the woman that he was in love with and living with, illegally, of course, his girlfriend. And so that enraged the government above everything else. I have seen Port Royal demolished, which was a grand old place, and they were furious about it in Paris. I have seen, and this all includes, a Jesuit adored. I have seen these evils, and I am not yet 20 years old. Now, of course, that was giving away a lot. And so immediately he was arrested again. So it was crazy for him to publish most of what he published. He was surprised in his rooms and arrested, and was allowed to take nothing with him when he was arrested except the clothes that he wore. He didn't even have time to say proper goodbye to his current mistress, Suzanne de Livry, but his best friend took over and moved into his place and right away took care of her from then on. In any case, he's just 20, and he is now already have been in and out of several prisons, and he's about to become internationally famous, spectacularly famous at age 24. He wrote a play based on the Greek tragedy of Oedipus. So everybody knew Oedipus, so he just took it, and then he created a French play, Oedipus, where he's telling the same story with similar characters, but where he adds his own little version to it all. And the play was witty and charming like everything he wrote, and so it had a stratospheric success on the stage in the main theater of Paris, like they'd never seen before. It just ran day after day after day after day. Everybody in Paris wanted to see the play. He became rich, he became famous overnight. 24, success overnight, and he will never stop being famous from 1718 to the day he dies in 1778. He never stops being famous. He's going to be internationally famous outside of France, other countries, because they will take the play and translate it. Now, the reason that it went beyond just a sheer sort of theatrical play thing was that in Paris, at the time, there was scandal about the fact that there was incest going on inside the palace. And the incest was supposed to be an incestual relationship between the regent, who was the uncle of the little baby king, and his daughter, that he was in love with her and was having an incestuous relationship. Now, we don't know that he was. There's no proof. There's no recording anywhere where he says, "Darling, I love having sex with you." Nothing like that. But everybody thought it. So when this play came along, which, as you know, if you'll remember your Oedipus, has a little bit of incest going on in the play, when that came along, people began to talk and said the whole point of writing the play was Voltaire's clever little way of calling attention to incest. So this caused the play to be even bigger than it would have been just by itself. So he was now super famous and also odious to the palace. The palace was extremely unhappy with this young Mr. Voltaire, and so he decided to go on a trip. Very good, very smart. And so he took a trip to England. So in 1726, he goes across the Channel to England and is going to be there for a couple of years, hosted by everybody, because he's famous. Everybody knows who he is. And so every single famous person in England, every duke and duchess, you name it, they're all inviting him to come and stay, and he does. He stays in their various beautiful country houses. He writes, he reads. He's good in English, so he's going to read everything he can get his hands on. He had letters of introduction. So he goes to England. That's the book that he publishes. And he had letters of introduction to everybody, the British Prime Minister, everybody. So he met everybody, every writer, every politician. Walpole is the Prime Minister. He's going to be the genius of the Conservative Party through the middle of the 18th century. So, and the Duke of Newcastle and the Duchess of Marlborough, who was the friend of Queen Anne, and by the Prince and Princess of Wales, and the King. Now remember, the kings in the 18th century are the Hanovers. So you have three: George I, George II, and George III, and they're the Protestant descendants of the Stuarts, who are brought over from Germany when Anne died in the beginning of the century. They bring over this Hanoverian king over because the English Constitution says no Roman Catholic kings, ever. We don't ever want another Roman Catholic king. We had one, that was too many. So we want a Protestant king, and therefore they had to go over and find one of the kids from King Charles, the Stuarts, over in Germany, who'd gone off and married a German, and now they'd produced this line of other kids, and so they could find one of those and bring that person to England. So that's Hanover, that's George I, that's the George that Voltaire will meet, and then there's George II and George III. As you know, George III, of course, gets the American Revolution. So he has letters to everybody, and he's living at various beautiful country houses and meeting everybody. And of course, all the writers, all the important people, Alexander Pope, Jonathan Swift, David Hume, all these people are going to be meeting him and talking about. Hume is the genius of English science. He's Scottish, of course, living in Edinburgh, but he's being celebrated, as the greatest scientific thinker of the British Isles. And so he's the person that Voltaire wants to meet. He will be absolutely delighted. How I love the English, he wrote. How I love these people who say what they think. So, in other words, here's this French intellectual who knows everybody in France, and he's only like 24, and he's in England, and he's stunned by the way people just tell him what they think. They're not afraid the government can hear. They're not afraid they're going to get arrested. They're not afraid the king will hear what they're saying. They're not afraid the king's girlfriend will hear what they're saying. So how I love the English. And see what the laws of England have achieved. Now, he saw exactly what England had achieved. He puts his finger right on it in his book, Letters Concerning the English Nation. See what the laws of England have achieved. They have restored to every man and woman, of course, his natural rights, from which nearly all monarchies have despoiled him. Remember, soon you're going to hear Americans writing declarations about the rights of man. You're going to hear people writing declarations about what men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. It's all this that he's talking with these English people about. This is all the seed that's going to be carried over to the Americans, and in 1776, all these things he's talking about. These rights are full freedom of person and property, and in France the king could seize people's property, to speak to the nation through his pen, to be judged in criminal matters by a jury of free men, by his peers, that goes back to the Magna Carta, and to be judged in any matter only according to precise laws, to profess in peace whatever religion he prefers, while abstaining from those employments to which only members of the Anglican Church are. In other words, there were rules and regulations that said if you're not Anglican, you can't have this place, you can't have this job. There were non-Church of England people in England in the 18th century of growing number. And so the rules for the nation will have to expand and will expand all during the 18th century, and then in the 19th century, total freedom for everybody, because the last group to get that freedom are the Roman Catholics. And don't be too mean to the English about the Roman Catholics, because you just have to keep in mind that the Roman Catholics, meaning the Roman Catholics, tried to kill their king, tried to kill their queen, tried to bomb the entire parliament, and did a lot of other very mean things. So no wonder they're a little bit upset with the Roman Catholics in the 1600s. They did have a couple of things that they were reasonable about. So that's why they said no more Catholic kings here in this country. And it takes a while to get the laws of England to give total religious toleration such that it included the Catholics. That'll be the last group. But in the 18th century, there are a lot of non-Church of England groups, breakaways, and the most important of all are who? Somebody must know who they are, because they're probably, the Methodists, exactly, the Methodists. So once the Methodism unfolds in the 1700s in England, this starts to open up the attitudes of Parliament and others about, well, what the rules should be about religious members and what you should do. So there they are. There are the rights of freedom of press, freedom of property. All of this he puts in his book, The Letters of the English Nation, and came home, wrote it all up, had it published. What happened? The printer was arrested. All the copies were seized. All the copies were burned publicly, and he had to leave again. He had to get, as quickly as he could, out of France and go to Switzerland. So how about that? He comes home, he writes his book about freedom, and he gets arrested. So if he'd staged that, if he'd paid the government to arrest him, he couldn't have done a better job of making himself even more famous than he had been when it all came down.